June the 1st, 2009. Air France Flight 447 is en route from Rio to Paris. Then the plane vanishes over the Atlantic. Flight 447 leaves Rio and heads north, following the east coast of Brazil. In charge of the plane is Captain Marc Dubois, aged 58, with almost 11,000 flying hours under his belt. The second pilot is 37-year-old David Robert, who's clocked up over 6,500 hours. The third pilot is Pierre-Cédric Bonin, whose wife is also on tonight's flight. Age 32, Bonin, with just under 3,000 flying hours, is the least experienced member of the crew. Bonin is sitting in the cockpit's right-hand seat. His captain, Dubois, is sitting on the left. Robert is taking the regulation sleep break in the small cabin to the rear of the cockpit. As they approach the equator, they will enter an area called the Intertropical Convergence Zone.
For aviators, that area is famous for creating convective weather or thunderstorms.
Michael de Villiers has analyzed the weather patterns on the night of the crash.
What it shows there is the areas that were forecast on the significant weather chart where there would be thunder activity, quite a few around. Thunderstorms are probably the most dangerous form of weather. It's strong updrafts and downdrafts. It can knock the aircraft around, can also cause structural damage if a thunderstorm is severe enough. You get icing, you get the hail, you get lightning, which can also damage an aircraft.
But several other flights crossing the zone that night do decide to divert around the storm.
Neige. 209 nœuds. Il y a un truc droit devant, et il y en a un autre derrière. Hein? Oh merde, non. Je baisse un peu la lumière intérieure pour voir dehors. Ouais. J'allume les feux pour voir. Ah voilà. Quoi? On dirait qu'on va rentrer dans les zones nuageuses.
1:51 a.m. Now the dimmed cockpit is suddenly lit up.
Ah bah manquait plus que ça. C'est quoi ça? C'est tout ce qu'il nous fallait, monsieur de Saint-Elme.
Veteran pilot Dubois recognizes the bright flashes as St. Elmo's fire, a spectacular electrical phenomenon common in the tropics.
There were a number of unusual things that started to happen. There was apparently a blue glow that was St. Elmo's fire, and that projects a very odd and eerie light into the cockpit.
Il va y avoir des turbulences quand j'irai dormir.
David Robert, who was having a break in the small cabin at the rear of the cockpit, will shortly swap places with Captain Dubois.
Bon, bah y a plus qu'à le réveiller, hein, c'est ça?
Before Robert arrives, Captain Dubois wants to establish who's going to fly the plane while he's on his break.
Ouais, c'est qui le pose? C'est toi? Bon, il va prendre ma place.
This means Bonin, with the least amount of flying hours on his record, will pilot the plane until the captain returns.
If a captain is going on the break, you would have thought that the priority would have been to have the most experienced person in charge of the aircraft and sitting in the appropriate seat.
T'as dormi? Moyen. T'as pas dormi? Il a dit moyen. Bon, allez, je me casse. Bon, ça va. Bon, les petites turbulences qu'on vient d'avoir, tu vas les même après?
Minutes after Captain Dubois leaves the flight deck, the weather deteriorates.
On va les appeler à l'arrière pour leur dire. Vache, heureusement que c'était la 330, hein. C'est clair. Moins 42 degrés.
Robert suggests changing course to avoid the storm clouds.
Tu veux pas tirer un peu plus sur la gauche, là? Excuse-moi? J'ai dit tu veux pas un peu plus tirer sur la gauche?
As Bonin steers the plane 12 degrees to the left, a sharp, chlorine-like smell spreads through the cockpit.
T'as touché la clim? J'ai rien touché du tout. Si c'est pas la clim, c'est quoi cette odeur? C'est l'ozone.
Robert, who's flown many trips across the tropics, instantly recognizes the strange smell, but it seems to startle his younger colleague.
C'est quoi ça? C'est un rapport avec le FIT? Non, l'ozone, c'est de l'air chargé d'électricité. Non. Ah non, d'accord.
There were unusual smells in the cockpit. There were electrical disturbances and electrical phenomena around St Elmo's fire and so on. So there are many things that can contribute to degraded pilot performance.
2:10 a.m. A loud sound is heard in the cockpit. Experts analysing the black box tape believe it's the sound of ice crystals hitting the aircraft. Then, an alarm is triggered. The alarm warns the crew that the autopilot has shut down and handed control back to them.
J'ai les commandes. D'accord.
Bonin is sitting in the right-hand seat and takes manual control of the plane. His more experienced colleague, Robert, is now effectively co-pilot. What the crew don't realize is that the plummeting temperature has caused ice to block 3 vital sensors, called pitos.
The pitot system, which basically detects the speed of the air against the aircraft, ended up becoming blocked. Therefore, that effectively dropped to 0 and they lost all speed indication.
The aeroplane, while it's in autopilot, suddenly said, "We know we're getting rubbish information here. We cannot deal with rubbish information, therefore we're going to trip the autopilot out and hand it back to the pilots. This is where they start earning their money."
But it's not an emergency. It just means that there is no forward speed information. In theory, when the ice melts, the pitot sensors will work again.
The drill is do nothing. Literally, just fly the aircraft, continue to fly it straight and level, leave the power where it is, because it's been working pretty well for you up until this point.
If the crews touch nothing, the aircraft will remain fairly stable while they sort themselves out and get the aircraft into a safe flight configuration. In the case of Air France 447, there was almost an immediate reaction by the pilot flying, and that actually made the situation worse.
Bonin controls the plane with a side stick.
He had the side stick in his right hand, and he just yanked it backwards.
In layman's terms, what the pilot flying did was pull back on the control stick, which caused a change in the pitch attitude to go nose up, causing the aircraft to climb.
The black box data confirms why Bonin wanted the plane to climb.
The aircraft instruments showed a loss of altitude of 400 feet or so.
But when the speed sensors froze up, the instrument displays gave the pilots false readings of their speed and altitude.
It was not an actual loss of altitude. It was only instrumental. It was false. It was wrong.
Ça n'affiche pas la bonne vitesse. On a perdu la vitesse, c'est ça?
You've got to rely on your instruments, and of course if your instruments are now faulty or telling you wrong information, then it's difficult to know where to take that, because you train to rely on these things.
Bonin decides to trust the instruments. He pulls back the stick and the plane starts to rise.
The aircraft will go up quite rapidly. In fact, one point it's climbing at 7,000 feet a minute, which is a very high rate of climb at that altitude.
Because he was going uphill into very thin air that the aircraft couldn't be supported by while it was at its weight, the aircraft started slowing down, just like if you leave your foot on the accelerator of a car and it starts to go up a hill, it will slow down unless you give it more gas. So this airplane was slowing down.
Now, another alarm rings out. The stall warning.
A stall happens when the aircraft is going too slowly for the wings to produce sufficient lift, and therefore the aircraft starts to drop, it starts to fall. It stops flying, starts falling.
To prevent the plane falling, Bonin needs to act quickly.
When the stall warning occurred, the pilots are expected to take an immediate action of changing the attitude, push forward on the side stick, reduce the angle of attack, and therefore recover from the stall.
The way to recover that is to get your speed back. And the way to get your speed back is to put the nose down and go downhill.
But Bonin doesn't put the nose down. He keeps the stick back, and the aircraft gains even more altitude, whilst continuing to lose speed.
Fais attention à ta vitesse. Fais attention à ta vitesse. Ok, je redescends. Stabilise. Ouais.
And that's really where things went from a very benign circumstance to a rapidly escalating, out-of-control circumstance.
Robert presses the crew call button. He wants to get Captain Dubois back from his break and onto the flight deck. But there's no answer.
Il vient ou il vient pas?
Air France 447 is now 7 miles above the sea and still climbing.
Once you're going up very, very fast, the speed is decaying very, very rapidly. If you kept pulling back, then you'd increase the rate of climb to a point, and the speed would decay until you got towards the point where the aircraft stalled. And then everything changes very dramatically.
Now, at nearly 38,000 feet, Flight 447 starts to drop.
On a pourtant les moteurs, qu'est-ce qui se passe, bordel? Tu comprends ce qui se passe ou pas? J'ai plus le contrôle de l'avion. J'ai plus du tout le contrôle de l'avion. Merde. C'est quoi là? Je crois qu'on va trop vite.
Just under a minute after he was first called, Captain Dubois returns to the cockpit, taking the jump seat behind the younger officers.
Bon, qu'est-ce qui se passe là? Qu'est-ce que vous foutez? Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe? Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Je sais pas ce qui se passe. Vers le contrôle de l'avion. On a totalement perdu le contrôle de l'avion. On comprend rien. On a tout tenté.
When the captain emerged onto the flight deck, that was a point at which a fresh set of eyes could have made sense of what was actually going on, and there was still time to recover the aircraft.
There wasn't any conversation about here's what happened and here how we got into it.
Alors tiens, prends ça. Prends ça. Le problème, c'est que j'ai pris de l'avion. D'accord.
The variometer, the instrument that measures the vertical speed of the aircraft, has stopped working.
J'ai plus rien qui s'affiche. On n'a pas une seule indication valide.
They were faced with unreliable indications of things, and they were trying to make sense of what was reliable and what the aeroplane was actually doing. So they were struggling to know what you could believe and what you couldn't believe.
Because Bonin is still pulling the stick back, the nose is up and the plane is stalling.
Je crois qu'on va à une vitesse de fou là. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
He thinks the plane is going too fast and moves to put on the air brakes.
At that point, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. The problem already was going too slow, and not having enough lift, the speed brakes would have made that worse.
David Robert rapidly overrules the man flying the plane.
Non, non, surtout sors pas les freins. Non? Ok. Les sors pas.
The aircraft now falls to below 30,000 feet, but they still have time to recover the situation.
If they had stuck the aircraft's nose down and applied a decent amount of power, they could have recovered completely from the stall and, with an undamaged aeroplane, resumed the flight.
Robert now takes over control of the plane without issuing the customary verbal acknowledgement. But he doesn't realize that Bonnat is still pushing back on his stick, and the crew concentrate on getting the wings straight rather than powering the plane downwards out of the stall.
Les ailes sont à l'horizontale, non? Les ailes à plat, là. Allez, allez, ça redresse sur l'horizon. Sur l'horizon.
They didn't understand what was happening to the airplane. They didn't have it. The picture they had in their head of what was going on was so confused that the actions they took, which they hoped would recover the airplane, were absolutely the wrong actions.
Non, tu montes, là. Je monte, là. Alors on descend. Tu montes. Merde, c'est pas possible.
The stall alarm, having rung 58 times, now cuts out. The ocean is now just 20,000 feet below the rapidly descending plane. Robert thinks he is flying the plane, but doesn't seem to realize that Bonnat is still pulling back on his stick and still keeping the nose of the plane up.
Attends, moi j'ai les commandes. C'est moi qui ai les commandes, non?
It certainly appears that there was a breakdown of the discipline and communication with it on that flight deck.
Ça y est, on va arriver au niveau centre.
Flying through, they say, flight level 100, which is 10,000 feet, I think that was a point where we went from, we have some time to figure this thing out, to like, we might not be able to save ourselves.
This aircraft was falling out of the sky like a stone. It was absolutely not flying. It was falling. And it was falling with its nose pointed upwards.
Remonte. Je garde à fond, là, depuis tout à l'heure.
Captain Dubois now gets the vital information. He realizes Bonnat has been pulling back on the stick, pushing the nose up, and stalling the aircraft.
Non, ne remonte pas. Non, descends.
To get out of the stall, Robert knows he must get the nose of the plane pointing downwards.
Alors donne-moi les commandes. À moi les commandes. Vas-y, fais les commandes. Attention, tu cabres. Je cabre. Il faudrait là, on est à 4000 pieds. Tu cabres là.
The aircraft was mushing down like that, nose in the air, and it was mushing down through the sky like that.
As they near 2,000 feet, the aircraft's ground proximity warning system detects the ocean below, and a new warning sounds.
Pull up! Pull up! Sink rate. Pull up!
Allez, tire.
Pull up!
Allez, on tire.
Pull up! Pull up!
On va taper.
Pull up!
Mais c'est pas vrai.
Pull up!
Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe? 10 degrés d'assiette.
The recording stops at 02 hours, 14 minutes, 28.4 seconds. A report by the BEA, the French Safety Investigation Agency, found that the disaster was the result of both technical and human factors that started when the AF447 speed sensors, called pitos, malfunctioned and tripped the plane out of autopilot. Thales, the manufacturer of the pitot, state the tubes had to operate under severe environmental constraints that were well outside of both the specified parameters and certification requirements. But this wasn't the first time that this type of pitot tube had failed. EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, were aware of 17 cases of pitot failure from 2003 to 2008, but state it was not reported to them that crews had difficulties in addressing the situation. The pitots had been qualified to high standards and therefore did not justify mandatory action.
Air France knew there was a problem with the pitot tubes, and by agreement they were going to phase in these replacement working pitots over a matter of months. But what they weren't going to do is to ground all their Airbus aircraft whilst these new working pitots are retrofitted. They felt that they could operate safely, in their opinion.
Airbus, the manufacturer of the A330, also stress the pitots fitted on the plane met all safety requirements.
All three pitot probes satisfied the requirements of the certification, and subsequent to the accident were retested and they still satisfied. In fact, they did better than the certification limits by quite a bit.
After the accident, EASA made installation of new pitots compulsory, and since August 2009, the entire Air France fleet of A330s is equipped with the new pitots. The investigation report also recommended improvements to A330 stall alarms and cockpit instrumentation. Primarily the plane's flight path navigational aid, the flight director.
The flight director was a bit confusing. And keep in mind, we've established already that the computers were confused, that they were still tending to follow the flight director commands.
Airbus say the pilots ignored operational procedure and should have turned off the flight director as soon as they lost their speed readings. But they will vigorously examine all recommendations made by the BEA. But does advanced technology always make flying safer?
The aeroplanes themselves, they may be simple to fly, they may have automation to help you do it, they may have computers to help you calculate things with incredible accuracy, but they are immensely complex. So if anything goes wrong, it's rather like something going wrong with your computer. An airplane's just a big bunch of computers nowadays.
So can we trust that pilots still have the skills to fly? The crew of AF 447 were fully trained and qualified. But the French investigation recommended additional training for pilots.
To some extent, this accident was predictable. We've known for a long time that there are areas where pilots need better training, and it's not just on Airbus type of aircraft, it's on all the modern jet fleet of aircraft.
Pilots who are primarily used to using all the automatics can have their manual flying skills degraded, and this is a concern within the industry, that is happening. And therefore, if you have an unusual situation that perhaps they haven't trained for, then it does rely on a discipline and appropriate training for those pilots to be able to say, I can still fly this aeroplane.
Air France state that over the past 3 years, simulator sessions have been introduced to address unsure speed at altitude, as well as new emergency manoeuvres in case of a stall situation. EASA say they are reviewing all safety recommendations made by the report, and if necessary, will then take measures to improve aircraft equipment and decide on additional training requirements.
This aircraft crashed because they didn't know what was going on. They should have known what was going on. Do I blame them? No, I blame the system, the training. The training. It's not Air France either, because Air France trains its pilots like other airlines train their pilots. It's the fact that the training that the law requires the airlines to do is all wrong. It does not address the needs of pilots flying modern, highly automated airplanes, and that is why Air France 447 happened.